Hello, everyone, and welcome. Joseph Kim and Chris Hoyt from Gamemakers here to introduce a new series on mobile user acquisition. The series is called State of Measurement Today in a Privacy First World. And essentially, the mobile user acquisition landscape has been going through a lot of changes with potentially huge impacts to game marketing and the success of games on mobile. And Chris, before we go ahead and jump into our first episode, I thought it'd be great if you could explain to the audience why this topic is so critical and also some of the topics that we will cover as part of this series.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and pleasure to be here and bring this content to you, the audience. We are seeing serious impacts around privacy and the ability to measure in a post-device ID kind of fingerprinting world. So we wanted to put together a 5-part series helping advertisers understand the measurement crisis and the different tools and measurement signals that will be available to you. So let me break the 5-part series down for you so you can get excited about this education and information. The first podcast in the series will be the overview of the measurement crisis. The second podcast will be the real state of Last Touch and the real value that Last Touch is bringing you. The third podcast will be an education on an incrementality testing and how it can be leveraged in a privacy first world. The fourth one will be the promise of MTA 2.0 and data clean rooms. So you understand some of the more fringe benefits of tools that are coming to you that may impact Last Touch. And the last bit is just a kind of a summary of those things as a roadmap to measurement success, helping you, the advertiser, take all that you've been educated on, turn it into action, and succeed. So we're really excited to cover all this with you and think it'll be highly impactful to your ability to win in this privacy first world.
I think you've explained it really well, Chris. I know a lot of people in the industry, not just UA marketers, but execs, product managers should learn this. And with that, we'll dive right into the first episode starting right now. Today's episode is sponsored by Data.ai to access estimates for rankings, downloads, revenue, usage, or engagement for millions of apps on the App Store and Google Play. Sign up for Data.ai. All right, hello, everybody. We are here with 3 experts on user acquisition, and we're going to be talking about something I think is very relevant to mobile gaming success. And there has been a lot of speculation about user acquisition, how effective distribution and marketing on the app stores has been post IDFA deprecation. And on Google, what will happen post GAID or the Google advertising ID deprecation? Further, we also don't know what will happen in a post fingerprinting deprecation environment. Are we there yet? Is that happening? So as far as I know, despite IDFA deprecation, a number of marketing channels still have goal-based sort of user acquisition campaigns available to marketers. We'll find out when we speak to these experts here. So I believe you can still do specific ROAS targeting other forms of event and value-based UA campaign optimization, even post IDFA, or perhaps not. I'll ask you guys. So today, to speak to the current and future state of measurement, the ability to attribute installs, we have brought together first Andrew Cavado, founder and managing director of Growth by Science. Next, we've got Warren Woodward, chief growth officer at Uptick, a growth marketing services company. And finally, John Wright, VP of publishing from leading hyper casual game studio, Kwalee. Welcome, guys. I was telling you guys, I'm so excited to have you guys on because this is a very important topic, one that I think there's a lot of confusion in the industry about, one I'm confused about. And so it'd be great to really go deeply into what the current state of the market is, what the future is. But I thought we could start by just kind of having a recap of what got us here. Why do we have confusion about the ability to attribute installs, to do measurement? What is a current state of measurement when it comes to things like, Apple's privacy policy? What is Google doing? GDPR, all that kind of stuff. Maybe we could just open it up to you guys to kind of set the stage and context for where we are today.
I'll give a quick opinion. I know this is maybe not a good one to go first because it's pretty contrarian, but I think measurement and attribution has been broken for a long time, but we've had access to data and we've developed an entire ecosystem and series of ecosystems around this obsession of user level data, stitching together paths to conversion in mobile, but even beyond mobile as well. And unfortunately, that's actually taken us down a really bad path. And so when all of the changes that have happened over the last few years, and I'll just highlight them very quickly, we've had regulatory changes at various states in the US, in South America, and Europe. And then we've had OS changes. So, starting with Apple, of course, restricting access to user identifiers, IDFA in particular. That, what I thought would happen, would be a catalyst for changing of this broken path to conversion paradigm. And it's not happened. And so what we've had instead is this explosion of technologies and methodologies that are trying to circumvent the restrictions of access to that user level data. And so I think that's kind of taken the industry for a little bit of a loop, and people are kind of grasping at straws and sort of trying to recreate this, keep the dream alive of what I call post-exposure attribution.
Right.
So my thesis is that stuff has been broken. Now it's hard to get at data, and it's still broken.
But Andrew, maybe I could ask you though, when you say it was broken before, what part of it was broken?
Yeah, great point. What was broken before about it is that any kind of post-exposure attribution is missing a causal impact of what are the ads doing to drive a conversion that would not have otherwise occurred. And there's a light, I would say that it's not totally 100% broken, but it's broken enough that if you go into that cycle and that feedback loop of something happens after a user sees an ad, and therefore that ad gets credit, that you end up leaving a lot of dollars on the table, a lot of conversion on the table, and you're paying what I like to call an ad tech tax, essentially paying for conversions that you would have gotten anyway, but it looks like your marketing is driving that. And so there's this whole just non-causal way of doing marketing that has been supported by the ability to look at data at a very granular level. And now that's been broken by a lot of the privacy and regulatory changes that we've seen. But people are still trying to go back to that. So what I'm advocating for is let's shift that, and let's actually use this as an opportunity to step outside that box.
Okay, and Andrew, and I'll hand it over to you, Warren, but just for our audience to explain, if I'm understanding you correctly, Andrew, what you mean is that even before, you might see multiple ads on different platforms, and there may have been a user that was going to install a game or something anyway. And so it's not 100%, it wasn't, even before, it wasn't 100% clear what caused an install or a conversion event or things like that. And so even before, even when you had like the user level information, like the initial exposure to conversion, that part was not 100% science. Is that what you meant?
That's correct. I'd say a quick summary before I turn it to Warren is it used to be not accurate, but very precise. Yeah. And now it is not accurate and not precise.
Okay. Warren?
Yeah, first of all, great to be here with you guys. So, Andrew, as you're describing that, the phrase that comes to mind to me is, I'm paraphrasing, but the colloquialism of "show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." And one thing, so like our team here at Uptick, like I come from, working at game publishers, running internal UA teams. Now we have, our team at Uptick where we help these teams and we build software to solve some of these problems. But we've encountered many times where we'll meet a team or somehow digging into the data of a project, and we discover one of the many examples of the things that you're talking about. I'll give two examples right here. Like one is when there's clearly some sort of impression, click spamming, impression spamming, something that's basically over-crediting an ad network. Another very common one is Apple Search, where we all know that, that's poaching some percentage of users that would be there anyway. No one in the kind of chain of order really has an aligned incentive to push against these things, other than a CEO or founder who doesn't have the time to get into that level of granularity. So it's come up time and time again where, like, interacting with teams actually doing growth, where it's like, hey, the CPIs actually aren't this low, or this ROAS actually isn't this good. Here's why. And it's kind of like, yeah, let's not talk about that because it makes my numbers better. It's like they're being judged by like, hey, how well are you hitting this KPI? These broken parts of the attribution system, encourage bad behavior and more of like it helps them achieve these KPIs. And if you look throughout the org, there's I think it's very fundamental to part of why mobile free to play is doing poorly right now is there's not in a typical company structure someone who owns the incentive to fight against these things.
Great points. Yeah,
right.
Totally. And I think it's worse from the ad platform side too.
Yeah.
Right.
And exactly. Warren, I think the point you're making is a point that a lot of executives don't understand. And I think it's such a not well understood issue that I think is absolutely critical if you really want to be successful and profitable. But John, do you have anything to add here? Or
I would say I'm not going to talk as smartly as the guys just did, because I'm just a lowly publishing person just trying to make his way in the gaming world. But what I would say, guys, is that, I was in desktop before mobile. I'm a certain age of a person with a certain career, and in my opinion, it's like last click is just, in 2024, are we really still working in such a fashion? Like in desktop 15 years ago, we were talking about like the bathtub model, right? And how the person who gave the first click would get half, and how the one at the end would get half. And it still sort of stumps me to this day that for the predominance of the industry is still working in such a fashion. And I think it goes back to what you both just said in terms of there's no incentive for a lot of these ad networks to change. And I think it's quite unfair to a lot of the people that are influencing the start of the funnel, which are not getting rewarded in such a way.
Right. So we've had all these changes, as you guys have outlined, at least at a high level. And the thing that I'm confused about right now is I'm hearing kind of different stories depending on who you are. So some people have said, ROAS has decreased, payback periods have increased. They're seeing performance degrade by 25 to 30%. I'm hearing from other folks that there has been no change to us from IDFA deprecation. And to some, I think to some degree, I think, Warren, the issue that you talked about might be the culprit, where people were doing their models and they just kind of got exposed. And was it IDFA deprecation, or was it your freaking aggressive model that actually was not, you know what I'm saying? But I want to hear from you guys. And John, I think it's great that you're here as a publisher, seeing performance on games and things like that. But in your view, what has been the actual impact of IDFA deprecation and these other things to the current state of the UA marketing landscape today?
There's two narratives going on at the same time. So if you talk to any individual company, particularly the larger they are, they'll say that they have a strategy, they have a great data team, great UA team, and that they've got iOS solved. But then if you zoom out and look at the macro and the trends in our industry, the massive layoffs, just anecdotally, how many great growth marketing and UA people that were like so in demand for so much of their careers that are now just hustling, unable to get full-time jobs. And it's very clear that part of the industry of doing profitable, straightforward user acquisition for half of the ecosystem on iOS, it's very clear that it's not solved for the industry at large. But there's a lot of emperor's new clothes where none of the big companies will outwardly admit that they have problems with this, but then you see it reflected in their actions. And there's been very little adoption of the industry for standardized solutions to address this. And again, it's kind of that lack of aligned incentives for it.
Yeah, from my side, guys, I would say that I'm definitely seeing it holistically across the space that eCPMs have been affected, right? And I think there is a part of it which is like certain genres are hit harder than others, but I think you can clearly see from the evolution from hyper casual to hybrid casual, and the fact that a lot of these studios are progressing to larger, more robust, more complicated games, which have like meta and deeper engagements that need a higher LTV. These companies wouldn't have been forced to make these changes, and you wouldn't be seeing a lot of these studios going under if the golden days of getting X LTV and a low CPI would have been continuing, right?
And John, maybe it's important to just kind of spell that out. I think you're probably more of an expert at the ad monetization side than I am, but can just people that aren't in the UA or ad mon weeds, like how do the things that we talked about directly correlate to you making less of the ads, or anyone running in-game ads making less on the ads in the games, that eCPM being lower?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's around the quality of the actual conversion, right? So the standardized metrics for this stuff on the creative side would be your CTR, CVR, which powers IPM, install per 1,000 mil. And depending on your CPI being cost per install times installs per 1,000 give you your total eCPM. So ultimately, what's generally happened is there's one part of it which is the supply has kind of been affected by the drop in eCPM, which has gone from a drop in user quality. So there is like a correlating factor of, the eCPMs have gone down, which means my LTV and my ARPU, my average revenue per user, has also taken a hit, which means that now, where you could do, say, an install for 50 cents and you made 60 cents, that same install is now costing you 70 cents or 80 cents, which means that the acquisition is unprofitable. This has had sort of a knock-on effect in terms of the amount of supply, because there's less new games launching, there's less, actual inventory to acquire, and we all know when supply goes down, cost goes up, and this has an effect on that buying power. And I think, very interestingly, I don't know if you listened to the Deconstructor of Fun podcast with the CEO of SciPlay, but they went from spending $3 million a month to $500K after IDFA. So there's no way that isn't a corresponding factor of deprecation. Okay, so yeah.
Well, I got a quick thing to jump in and offer I don't disagree with any of that, but I'll offer maybe a different dimension to it. So I've seen a lot of data that supports this, which is, yes, if you look at, say, platform level CPI metrics or whatever, and you look at and you chart that over time, the trends over time, and you look at when IDFA deprecated, when iOS 14 launched, you can see an absolute spike. Now, however, when you juxtapose that against an incrementality based CPI, do anyone want to guess that line is absolutely flat? So to me, that says two things. One, it's not necessarily a performance issue; it's a perceived performance issue because the measurement's impacted by the IDFA deprecation, right? You get less matches, you get less high fidelity matches. It looks like fewer things are happening. And so, for the same spend, you get less attributed installs, right? And so therefore the CPI goes up. But the other thing that it tells me, and that at least it hints at strongly, is that goal-based bidding does not work from an incrementality perspective. Because if it did, right, you would assume that the incrementality would decrease and the cost per incremental install would increase after iOS 14, but it did not. And therefore, that level of performance does not actually impact incremental installs, incremental conversions, right? Yeah. And so I think...
Andrew, if I could just ask you to pause real quick and for our audience, because we don't have all UA experts, and I'd love to have this conversation be as accessible as possible. So when you talk about incrementality, and I think people kind of get the notion of like goal-based targets, but in terms of incrementality, if you could just kind of quickly explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. So incrementality refers to essentially installs, conversions, whatever that you would achieve or attain as a direct result of those ads. So they're incremental to some base level of organic installs, right? These also referred to as causal installs. Usually they're measured by something like a holdout test, right? Where you've got ads live in certain geographies or audience segments or whatever, and you've got a statistically comparable audience that you do not show ads to, and you look at subsequent behavior of those two respective cohorts. And when you do that, the delta in conversions, installs, whatever that you realize is the incrementality, the incremental installs. Now that differs from what you will see in a platform, which would be a post-exposure install, last touch, or U-shaped, or whatever attribution model. But those two metrics are very different. And so what I'm describing here is that when you don't really care if you're doing geo-testing, for example, you don't really care about IDFA disappearing. It doesn't impact necessarily your ability to do those incrementality tests, but it obviously does impact the post-exposure way of measuring. And so the fact, that trend that I described where you see the CPI spike after iOS 14 is indicative of it being a measurement issue, a perceived performance issue, and not a true performance issue, which is measured by the incrementality way.
Right. So if I could simplify that, what you might be saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that certain games might have a base level of organic installs. And when you do like paid marketing campaigns, you would attribute some installs to those paid campaigns. Some of them which are from those paid campaigns, but because of like the inability to measure, you're not. Some of that organic baseline may be attributed to the paid, or maybe they're not attributed enough, and that inability to exactly attribute those installs to the paid campaigns is where there may be some confusion in terms of how you measure. Is that what you're saying, Andrew?
Almost, yeah, almost.
Okay.
I would say it's more that when you've got a level of installs,
yeah,
because of the way that goal-based bidding works and because of the way that post-exposure attribution works,
yep.
It looks like the ads are driving more installs than they're actually driving. And so when you lose IDFA and you lose the ability to connect conversions or installs to an ad exposure, it looks as though you're spending the same amount but getting fewer installs. But actually, all that's happening is fewer installs are getting associated to the ad spend. But if you take that and put off the side and you measure the exact same situation with an incrementality approach, you will typically see that there's not a lot of incrementality, and that level of incrementality does not match to either the pre or post IDFA level of attributed installs. And so the point is that's what in the first kind of diatribe I said here, where like measurement was broken even before iOS 14. That's what that's referring to. And so basically, if more advertisers focused on incrementality, they wouldn't care as much about iOS 14.
Andrew, I've got going off piste here a little bit, Joe. I'm sorry, but like, why do you think then? And this is to you as well, Warren. But yeah, why do you think that people are not focusing on this more? Like, why are not more game companies and businesses in my position working on an incrementality model? And why hasn't this been, adopted by the masses?
I mean, I've definitely got thoughts here, but Warren, as somebody who's in a hot seat, maybe you could tell us what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what you just said, Andrew, we see in conversations we have with gaming companies and in our own data, which, to paraphrase, like, yes, the CPI directly attributed to Facebook shoots up, but your eCPI it stays flat relatively on iOS. The thing I would push back, well, I guess I would half agree, is that goal-based buying doesn't work. I would say it absolutely doesn't work with the existing tools out of the box you get from the MMP. But to actually do profitable UA, you absolutely must find a way to do something that proxies that. And that can maybe touch on to your point, John, like nothing about the value, I think, plays a huge role in overall measurement. But our team took a different approach to solve the same problem. And I just want to kind of like talk it through as another lens and why we did a different approach. So what we saw is just like the data needs to be normalized. That's like a huge part of what we're talking about. Like Android data is still basically normalized when you look at all the channels side by side to each other. But in iOS, just to give like 3 examples, Apple Search uses its own logic, which is not scan, it's not fingerprinting. They just have their own rules. And then we have all of the networks that still do fingerprinting, where it's close to 1-to-1, although we find there's about a 30% variance, which is still huge. And then we have the last bucket, which is driven primarily by Facebook, where we see about 1 out of 7 users opt in. So you're only seeing about 1/7 of the revenue data. And then Google Ads, lastly, is the most extreme because YouTube doesn't even ask for consent for that pocket of inventory. So we see something like 1 to 100 to 1 out to 300 iOS Google Ads users opt in. So that's all to say, if you look at all of your channels, iOS and Android, next to each other and are just trying to see ROAS, you've got at least 4 different models floating around, and it's completely unnormalized. And this is kind of the gap in the stack. For us, we had to solve this. So like we built a system for this over 2 years ago because like we only get brought in if we can drive incremental profit from UA. So when these changes happen, we're like, shit, do we still have a business? And we scrambled and tried different things. What we landed on was approach that I would not say is like contrary to incrementality. If anything, maybe it's supplementary. But what we do is what I describe as dynamic polling. So we use scan installs as a source of truth for CPI and install count. And then we normalize every channel. So if we already have most covered by probabilistic, we'll basically dedupe that against the scan installs. But where it gets more interesting is Facebook, for example. So in that example that I described earlier, 1 out of 7 users consent to be tracked. at a high level, what we're doing is for every campaign segment, if you're a user that agreed to be tracked, we're surveying you and applying your LTV curve to the rest of the segment. So that lets us like still use goal-based systems, but normalize them for the amount of opt-in that we have as individual segments, because it is a survey
and
model.
Warren, when you say segment, when you say segment, do you mean part of the same UA campaign or as part of a daily cohort? How do you define
both? So we as we've built out our software for this, we've kind of added layers to it. So we'll basically kind of roll up to the next subset where it has enough data. So if like individual campaign has an accurate amount of data, it'll model at that level. If there's not enough there, it will model at the ratio of the like country plus ad network plus OS.
Got it. Okay. And maybe just for our audience. So I think, Warren, you've done a great job of kind of giving us a high level overview of how people are trying to do measurement to the best of their ability, given that these privacy changes broke what, Andrew, you're calling the post-exposure attribution system. And just for our audience, so basically what Warren's talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but because of IDFA deprecation and the previous ability to get user level, device level data and to attribute actions and behavior to users, now they're doing all these things that Warren's talking about, these four different methodologies, fifth, including Warren's dynamic, what he's calling dynamic polling system, which I think is probably unique to your company, perhaps, Warren. But now maybe if you guys could also talk about why is this a big issue, or is it because you can do these 4 or 5 different approaches? How big of a deal is IDFA deprecation?
These things are all a pain in the ass. Firstly, it's like
reach.
Like doing it accurate is a huge pain in the ass. That we like the amount of engineering time we had to do to productize the thing that we do is a pain in the ass. Like I think that's number one at the most basic level. I mean, Andrew, what do you think? Why do you think there's still the default is that most teams don't have systems for this?
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you say that it impacted the end. I feel like that's one of the things, depending on how you're building it, that could be pretty insulated against it.
Yeah, I should clarify. I think these are kind of independent. So I think our focus was more as like, hey, we still operationally need to make like optimizations every day down to a granular level. But to be clear, it's not like I don't see it as either or.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, like what it has done, at least from my vantage point, is it's made what UA folks have done for like a decade or more. It's made that virtually impossible, right? Like you used to be able to go in and look at all this granular data and make tweaks kind of on the fly, do really interesting cohorting and segments and all of that. And you could trust that it would sync across all of the different ecosystem pieces. And now that doesn't work, just like you described, Warren. It's, everybody's using their own system and the data's, it's asymmetric and all of that. And so this is kind of going back to my obsession of incrementality, why I think moving to that approach, which is agnostic to all of this, is a lot better. And it's certainly not easy to do that. It does require a lot of paradigm shifting, right? Like if you're looking at, and just using MetricWorks, Joe, you obviously are familiar with these guys, right? As an example. Mm-hmm. So they're, for folks that aren't familiar, they're what I call a triangulation system of measurement for in the mobile space, right? So they've got ground truth incrementality, and they still rely on where available attributed data to split things up. So putting all that together, you get a single metric that at the end of the day is calibrated in incrementality. So something like that is an awesome way for advertisers to really start to lean into that style of measurement. But what it any kind of system that relies on that, what it's not really going to be, and what's not going to enable, is like that micro tweaking that I think a lot of UA folks have relied on in the past to look at like what that, how that's going to change sort of an attributed outcome. My feeling is that a lot of that wasn't adding a ton of value, and at least the data that I have seen that is causal, that is incremental, has proven that. But I mean, there's whole organizations and politics and compensation and bonuses and funding that's all based on that. And so to shift the industry so rapidly, it's just not that easy to do. And that's why, Warren, you pointed out earlier, right? There's layoffs and big changes. And I think that is a symptom of the industry realizing that there has to be a shift, but we haven't quite landed on what that is. And maybe one path is, some of these AI type campaigns, I don't necessarily think so, but maybe could be just, taking getting out of the weeds a little bit, leaning into some of the inherent fuzziness and distribution and statistical nature of these more, statistical type measurement techniques. But in any case, there has to be a shift, and we just haven't fully gone through that shift as a UA industry yet.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So, sorry, John. I was just about to say, and I'll hand it over to you. So it kind of sounds like there isn't a perceived best practice in terms of how to do this measurement stuff, right? So, Warren, you're using like a unique proprietary dynamic polling system. Andrew, you're kind of advocating for like this incrementality MMM triangulation approach. John, I'm wondering what you do, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, guys, if I'm honest, I think both what Warren and Andrew are doing is much more complex than what we are doing and what the most of the gaming sort of companies are doing right now. I find what you're saying is ultimately very, very interesting, guys. I think for the most part, again, most companies are still working in the traditional fashion with the same MMPs, right? The same names that we're used to, working in the same ways in terms of like last click. And there has obviously been dramatic shifts in the spending behavior and how we invest money in UA. Traditionally 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago, we would probably spend 70% of our budgets on iOS, right? And 30% on Android. Now we're spending 50-50 because, again, it has become much more difficult. And this is, something that is across the entire board. It's not just like certain channels that have been affected. It was like the whole thing. And, we traditionally always did sort of like source level optimization, right? So maybe some companies were very technical and did user level stuff and retargeting through the DSPs, etc. But a lot of the time it was source level bidding, which was going to a particular, subsource or a supply source and then adjusting the CPI based on the actual ROAS of that source, right? And effectively what this did is it increased the averages of the campaigns or for that game because you're bidding on better quality from this source that has better users versus a lower source, right, depending on genre, etc. So all of that was done very, very manually until a couple of years ago. Now there are some ROAS optimizer tools in the likes of AppLovin and Iron Source, and these companies have built this stuff. But honestly, and to be brutal, to be a bit brutal here, I think a lot of people just don't know what the fuck's going on. We're learning every day. We're trying to pivot. We're trying to do as much as we can, but it's tough out there, right? I feel every company is feeling it right now, and everyone's trying to do smart stuff. We're trying to do smart stuff. We're updating our models all the time, and we're winning in certain aspects. I'm very fortunate that Kwalee is a growing company, right, rather than one that's staying flat. But it's tough out there, really.
Right. But John, I think like to some degree, your ability to continue to leverage existing ad networks, whether it's AppLovin or Unity or some of these other companies, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is because these companies are using fingerprinting technology to still be able to get some level of attribution. Now, so the rumor is that Apple's going to crack down on fingerprinting. And so I'm wondering from your perspectives, the three of you guys, what is going to be the impact of this? Because I'm hearing different things. Oh no, like AppLovin's going to be fine. They're going to work around, do some other stuff.
Yeah.
Or the fingerprinting crackdown is not actually going to happen. So I'm wondering, kind of a two-part question to you guys. What do you think will be the impact of whatever Apple does in a post fingerprinting deprecation world, if that happens? And then what can ad networks do to respond to this in some way? Will there be some new technology, something with an SDK, something with something else? Or are we pretty much just going to be in a world where we're really guessing when it comes to user acquisition?
I was just going to say, guys, I think you both will have much bigger points on this than me. But from my perspective, I think Apple do what they say, right? So I'm not looking. I don't think, and based on privacy and based on everything else that they've been doing over the last 2 years, I think we are moving to a fingerprint-less world, right? I'll be shocked if anything changes. I think they're gonna get rid of it. That's my personal opinion, and I think. Obviously, I'm at a Games Forum Barcelona, and there's been a lot of talks on this the last couple of days. And essentially, a lot of people are saying that the networks themselves will figure out something smart because that's why they're billion-dollar companies and they employ all of these amazing engineers. And if that's some sort of server-to-server sort of set up, or if that's some sort of thing, something off the back of an SDK that's already integrated. I really don't know. But I think categorically it's going to be bad for a lot of us. And I really hope that either the networks themselves or a very smart tech provider out there comes up with a solution, because otherwise I think maybe there'll be more companies going out of business. So, yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, to chime in here, John, you alluded earlier, it's just like, it's all kind of a mess. Everyone's just trying to do their best in the situation. We're very intentionally focusing on the knowns. Like when there's rumors of like how a new version of Scan is going to function, or rumors of what's coming for Android, we devote like literal 0 cycles to developing for that until we see how the data comes in, how the ad networks are reacting to it. But then it's like all hands on deck. And it's just, there's such a gap in what people are doing today with the data and tools available, versus like what you can do, that it's not even worth starting to think about these like what ifs, or like I better like design this thing in case like this happens with Android. That's kind of like our personal approach to it. It's like there's so much room for improvement with just the data as it flows today, and like what the current version of Scan is, that we need to focus on solving those problems just to have some kind of competitive advantage.
Yeah, I mean, look, fingerprinting is, I think it is eventually going to go away. Yes, so I do believe that it's going to get crushed. My opinion on generally how to approach this evolving landscape of data is, if you can do one of two things. So there's, Warren's has one approach, which is, if you can do this and if you have the right resources to manage for the current situation, and as things pivot, you pivot right away. I don't think a lot of companies are really as well organized to be able to do that out there. And so I would take, and I've always advocated for companies that can't, be as nimble as that, to think, where is the ball going to be, 3 or 4 months from now, 5, 6, 12 months from now, whatever. And my opinion is that all of this user level data will eventually go to 0, or close enough to it to effectively be 0. So you should be operating with that mindset. And that doesn't mean necessarily ignore everything that you have at your disposal right now, but assume that whatever you have is ephemeral. It's not going to be around, that you might have to operate in a world eventually where there is no data, and plan for that. And so just as an example of that, when I work with my growth marketing clients, we don't install any SDKs. We don't install any pixels. We don't do anything like that. All we do is we look at events that we can track from a first-party perspective from a website or app or whatever, and we look at ad spend data, and we design sophisticated causal learning agendas with incrementality, and we buy only on signals that in aggregate. So that means managing to reach and frequency. That means relying on first-party targeting that we know are native to whatever platforms or networks we're buying ads on, and that means using a feedback loop of really just with the incrementality testing. And when you do it that way, you get two things. One, you start to understand just how truly difficult it is to get ROI positive incrementality results, but you can do it, and it just takes some time. You can get there. And then two, just how far apart any platform metric. So in the cases where we do have platform metrics still, when you get like, oh wow, our incrementality numbers look great and we're profitable, and then you look at the platform metrics, they're like so unprofitable looking, right, and you're just shocked. And I think when you finally get that, that's when I've seen growth marketers have the real aha moment. It's like, wow, this shit's really, really wrong, and it doesn't work. And so what I'm hoping is that as more of this data dies, more and more advertisers and growth marketers go towards that more scientific approach and start to see that light.
Andrew, I think so much of that is true. One thing I'd love you to expand on, because I think you're closer and more an expert in this area than I am, is like, as or some sort of incrementality is becoming more necessary, like where are we today as far as like the limitations of that? So like historically, what I've at least perceived as the limitations is like just time horizon and amount of historical data. So like there's really important edge cases, at least in that historical limitation, which is like, cool, I launched a game yesterday. I need to decide what moves to make, to be like very extreme on one end. But like where are we kind of at with sort of the evolution of these types of models and the operationalizing of them, and what are still the current limitations to them? Like when do they start adding value, and what are the limitations before that can kick in?
Great question. I do think there are limitations. I'm not suggesting that MMMs are perfect by any sense. I think MMMs have come a long way in that you can update them more frequently. You can often use less data. It really depends on the way that it's modeled, the way that it's put together. But if you think of like your granddaddy's MMM, right? I took 2 or 3 years worth of data. It took a year to build, and it was primarily for big CPGs that had to wait for a lot of data to come in. It often was delayed by months or quarters before they could even do it. And it was more of a retrospective thing. A lot of the modern ones are more forward-looking. They're more predictive. They use basically a type of methodology that you can calibrate with, incrementality results or other types of, say, known outcomes that you can plug into them and calibrate them. And so they definitely have come a long way. But the reality of it is, even like the measurement style that I described, it's got its blind spots, and it's sort of like lack of perfection, right? What I suggest, and sort of my perspective on it, is that you still have the same blind spots and tacks if you don't use that, and if you use something more granular. It's just different. And so I would my assumption and sort of my position is that the trade-offs of using a scientific based incrementality plus attribution combined has less extreme trade-offs and less extreme of a measurement tax, if you will, than staying in the old school way. And I just think people are so used to that they haven't quite grokked that, and they'd rather be able to see the data right away, be able to act on it right away, and be able to see like a single tangible number that they can rate as either good or bad, versus maybe adding fuzziness around all that, but being a lot more accurate in terms of the ROI. And so that's really like, in terms of a mental model, what marketers need to get there. And not just marketers, by the way, but CFOs that are putting budgets on, that are looking at, reports for marketing and UA and saying, well, I don't understand these like distributions and confidence intervals and all of that. And so there is, I think, a broader education that's required. But to your point, it's not perfect. There are fuzziness around it, and it's just a matter of understanding what that is and what type of fuzziness do you prefer.
Right. And Andrew, you kind of paint a pretty bleak portrait of the world coming up in a post-fingerprintless kind of world. But maybe I can ask Warren and John. So in this world that Andrew paints, and I think user data doesn't go to zero, right? Because at least you have like some opt-in. And Warren, I assume your dynamic polling methodology would still work in this case. But John and Warren, what do you guys do post, the deprecation of fingerprinting?
Warren, you want to start, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can start here. So yeah, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here. I mentioned earlier, we're really focused on play the field, like, where things lay. But at the same time, we're very mindful of, as we productize things, make them generic. And we've already had this happen several times where the attribution logic for a given network will change. And the nice thing with how we built it, it's a generic enough system. So it's just, even for, an extreme sample like Facebook, as we saw the opt-in go down with adoption, the model just updates in time, and it's just, you're surveying a smaller percentage of the population. So of course that with any surveying methodology, it's going to decrease accurately. But I think that's the way we do try to adapt, is just say, okay, well, what do we know? We know that we'll probably have this data in decreasing frequency in the future and in high variance. So how can we make sure our tools are built with that in mind, and not for like the explicit setup that we have today?
Yeah.
What about you, John?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Warren. I think, look, JK, I think all of us have been in this space for a long time. We've seen a lot of adversity, and we're all still here.
Yep.
Right? And,
yep.
Shit hits the fan very often in this industry, my friend. And like I said, there's still billion-dollar companies out there, and there's still new business happening every day, and new tech being built all the time. And I'm an optimist. I think this is another hurdle that we need to get through, right? As a collective, as an industry. But we are still a solid ecosystem. We're still some very, very smart people in the space. And I think maybe in the long term, this will be a good thing. Like, a lot of the stuff that Andrew and Warren have spoken about today is really smart stuff that I'm even only barely learning about now. And if this is a forcing agent that creates a much fairer world, then all of this trouble going through now in a year or in 2 years or in 5 years will just be for the benefit of all of us. So, like I said, I think new product coming to market, new ways of working, smart people figuring shit out. That is, where we're going to be. So look, whilst the immediate future might be a little bit bleak, I'm still, I've been in this game a long time and I'm still here. So I don't think this is going to be the thing that kills me yet.
John, you're filling me with so much hope. For anyone watching on video, there's an angelic glow from the light above John, and as he's giving this inspirational speech about how this is going to bring us all to a better space, I can't help but be filled with hope.
I love it. I'm a follower. I love it, John. I totally agree with you, man. It's a great perspective.
I love the optimism, but maybe we could also, just as a question to you guys, in this new world that we're facing, what, in terms of like who could be impacted, just thinking strategically and for people to understand, I would think that companies that use fingerprinting for their user acquisition campaigns, like an AppLovin or a Unity, some of these ad networks would be impacted. Maybe game studios with long payback periods, with a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether the amount that they spend will pay back or not. But can you guys comment quickly on like what companies do you think could be the most impacted by these changes coming up?
Yeah, I mean, it's who's not. I mean, let's go through the list. Like anyone building a mobile game is impacted. Any ad network is massively impacted. All of the technology providers that provide, specifically attribution providers, they've all been scrambling and don't have normalized solutions. Like it's hard to find part of the ecosystem. Like the better question is like who's not impacted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I could ask one last question for you guys. So we are where we are, and there's a lot of speculation in terms of what the ad networks would do. Maybe there's new technology, maybe this, maybe not, who knows? But in your specific perspective, in your view, what does the future state of measurement look like to you guys? And I think, I don't know, Andrew, it seems like you kind of have a specific view, but I'd love to just have it be specifically articulated by each of you guys about what this looks like in the future. And maybe starting with you, Andrew.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've kind of spoken about it. I think there's going to be a big segment of the market that moves away from user level data almost entirely and leans into triangulation solutions, incrementality, aggregate based measurement. However, one thing I didn't mention, but I do think will be a big part of this ecosystem is this idea of privacy enhancing technology, clean rooms. And I think that will be primarily the realm of really large enterprise organizations and power very big partnerships that exist with companies that have a large amount of first party user data. So I think there'll be some combination of those two. Probably the torso and longer tail will be more the former, and the big folks will lean into that privacy enhancing technology world.
Maybe John?
I would love to say I believe what Andrew just said. Sadly, I think a lot more of the same, guys, with just these limiting factors in place. I would love to say I think that, in the next couple of years, an incrementality will become, the primary, but I still think we're a little bit away from that. I think there's some other factors that need to change in the industry before we get to that as the primary. So I think things will stay the same, but different. Like there's going to be a few more minor changes than a complete colossal shift. But hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully Andrew's right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to say this without just like being overly shilly of uptick. But I mean, we put our money and our resources like where we believe this is headed as far as like what we're building for it. So I'll try to answer more generically, which is that I think it's extremely clear at this point. You can't operate your business with the two main data sources that we had in the past, which was the data you get from the ad network and the data you get from your MMP. We're going to hit this era where there has to be a data science or modeling layer that's interpreting and normalizing that data that can be operationalized to make day-to-day decisions. So I think MMMs and incrementality is part of that. And also the kind of things that our team's focusing on that are all more for like day-to-day operations, but one way or another, not that it has to be, any one provider on the market or that you have to build it yourself, but you can't, the systems as we've been given them do not answer the questions that we need answered today. And we have not built out that next leg as an industry or agreed upon it enough, but like that, it's inevitable that that has to be introduced in order for companies to survive this phase.
Right. All right, guys. Well, I want to thank you guys for your time, expertise, inputs. I do feel like we should probably do another podcast going more specifically into incrementality. So for the audience, watch out for that. But thank you guys so much. I've learned a lot. And for our audience, we'll catch you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
y'all.
everybody.
Thanks, guys.